everyone, and thank you for joining us here tonight at the Gnomon School of Visual Effects and Animation for Film and Games for our evening with some truly incredible, multiple award-winning talents here on the stage from Google Spotlight Stories. So we're honored to have with us tonight the director of the Book of Life and son of Jaguar, Jorge Gutiérrez. So can we begin with a huge round of applause, please? So the Book of Life was nominated for a Golden Globe Award for Best Animated Feature Film. It's won an Annie Award for Outstanding Achievement in Character Design in an Animated Feature Production. So really amazing stuff. And Son of Jaguar has also been nominated for an Annie Award for Best Animated Short Subject. So that's really impressive stuff. We're also thrilled to have the director of Sonaria joining us tonight, Scot Stafford. So let's have another round of applause for Scott. So Sonaria is Scott's directorial debut, and he's sound supervised and/or composed all 12 of the Google Spotlight stories to date. He's worked with Glenn Keane, Sweetland, has had his music appear in dozens of films, and Keane's duet as well, which is very cool. And today, the VES has nominated Sonaria for Outstanding Visual Effects in a real-time project as well. So that's pretty sweet. Congratulations, guys. So also joining us tonight on the stage is producer of Son of Jaguar and former CG supervisor at Pixar Animation, David Eisenmann. So another round of applause, please, for David. So David's worked across films including Finding Nemo, Ratatouille, the Toy Story movies, A Bug's Life, Monsters University, and the beautiful short film Piper as well. He's also won an Emmy for producing Patrick Osborne's Pearl, which we actually featured here at Gnomon this time last year as an event, which you can check out on our live stream channel if you missed it. And last but certainly not least, we are joined by technical art lead for the Google Spotlight stories, Cassidy Curtis. So another round of applause, please. So Cassidy was previously supervising animator at DreamWorks, where he worked on a host of feature films, including Madagascar 2, How to Train Your Dragon, so many cool movies. And he also worked on Patrick Osborne's short film Pearl and developed the beautiful non-photorealistic look of that film, which if you haven't seen it, please do look up Pearl online. It's so beautiful. We featured it here last year, and it's one of my favorites. So really incredible lineup, as you can see. We can't wait to go behind the scenes of Son of Jaguar and Sonaria in just a moment. If you're joining us on live stream or Facebook Live, please talk to us throughout tonight's event. We'll be on the live stream, live chat, where you can chat and submit questions for our guests. You can also tweet questions using hashtag Gnomon on Twitter, so we'll look out for those, and we'll be on Facebook Live as well. So just talk to us. If you're here in the audience tonight, if you have a question for tonight's guest, please raise your hands, and we'll bring the microphone to you. That makes sure that our speakers can hear you properly, and also so our online viewers can hear you as well. I'd like to give a big thanks to Fumi at the PR Kitchen, who's towards the back. She's helped us bring... Thank you, Fumi. And also a huge thanks to Sarah and Zaria at Google, who've helped us bring this event together tonight. Oh, and they also sent some amazing T-shirts. So we have 6 shirts to raffle at the end of tonight's event. So hopefully you got a raffle ticket when you came in. We have some beautiful enamel pins as well. So towards the end of the night, we'll do the Q&A session. I'm going to give everyone a pin that asks a question. And we have 6 shirts and pins to raffle off. So make sure you stick through to the end. And then, of course, huge thanks to our sponsor, Lenovo, as you can see on the side here, for helping us to bring these free educational events to you. Our students use Lenovo workstations here on campus. And actually, we'll be doing a guided tour of campus after tonight's event ends. So if anyone wants to go look at the classrooms, check out the new library, which we launched this term, you can join us for that. And I was going to invite people, so tonight's event is obviously about these beautiful VR immersive films. We have a VR lab here on campus, so if anyone would like to go and check them out, actually on the Vive, just let us know and we can take you on upstairs and show you that. So you'll get to see it on here up the screen, but if you want to see it in VR and you don't have access to that technology at home, just let us know. So I think that's it. I always talk too long, I'm sorry. Let's hand over now to David, who's going to take over from here. So another big round of applause, please.
Thank you, Lynette, for such a wonderful introduction. And thank you, Gnomon University, for hosting us and inviting us here. And thank you all for coming on an evening, on a school night, nonetheless. I'm David Iseman, technical project lead production at Google Spotlight Stories and producer of a number of shorts, including Son of Jaguar. Google Spotlight Stories is a research and development team inside Google whose focus is on helping create the future of storytelling through emerging technologies and platforms. And we'd like to present two of those to you tonight that we released back in November, first being Son of Jaguar, as we've presented. That was presented across mobile VR, both HTC Vive and Oculus, as well as mobile VR platforms, which would include Google Daydream, Cardboard, various mobile phones, you name it, across our app, as well as Sonaria, which, as you heard and we heard today, was nominated for a VS award that we couldn't be more proud about, that with our director, Scott Stafford. We have three presenters, and I'm going to be brief. First is Jorge, who's already the man who needs no introduction. Jorge Gutiérrez. Can't wait to hear a little bit about behind of making Son of Jaguar and what it means to be into VR space for the first time. And then following that is going to be Cassidy Curtis. Cassidy, as she said, 19 years at DreamWorks, is that right? Yeah, 19 years. So he was one of the early adopters of the medium back in the day. But he's going to take us through the meat and bones of making one of these productions. And then our own Scott Stafford, who is our creative director of music and sound at Google Spotlight Stories. And I think you've composed and or supervised all of our productions, right? One of the two? Yeah. And also the distinguished honor of being the director of Sonaria. So he's going to start with Son of Jaguar and then bridge to Sonaria. And then afterwards, I'm going to come back and we're going to try something out, a little bit of a quick discussion. I have some panel discussions that we're going to ask ourselves, and then get the discussion rolling and then open that up to you guys. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is show the trailer for Son of Jaguar for those of you that haven't seen it, and then we'll hand it over to Jorge. So thank you. Right, one of the two? Yeah. And also the distinguished honor of being the director of Sonaria. So he's going to start with Son of Jaguar and then bridge to Sonaria. And then afterwards, I'm going to come back and we're going to try something out.
We wanted the eagle to pick up his father's mask, but Son of Jaguar failed his father's legacy, and as we all know, lost his leg in a tragic match. Papa!
Whatever happens in there, you take care of your mom and sister for me, okay?
And now, hailing from Tijuana, the one, the only Son of Jaguar!
Watch the leg!
You are nothing, Son of Jaguar! Nothing!
Help, Papa!
Whatever happens in there, you take care of your mom and sister for me, okay?
Okay, see, can you guys hear me good? Okay, so Son of Jaguar, I'll start from the beginning. I was a VR cynic, like I'm sure a lot of you secretly are. First time I heard VR is a new language of cinema, blah, 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 I was like, bullshit. Cinema's 100 years old. Who are these whippersnappers saying they're reinventing storytelling? And then I saw Glenn Keane's duet, which was the first one that I was like, son of a bitch, this is really good. And then I saw, if you guys haven't seen it, you guys should totally see Patrick Osborne's Pearl. That's the one I saw where I like literally took off the VR goggles and I was crying, and I was like, please let me see it again. And it was one of those moments where I thought, okay, I get it. We're not reinventing story in VR, but we are reinventing the way stories are told, right? And so I took up the challenge from Jan Pinkava and Karen Dufalo and David. We had a lunch and where they told me the worst thing they can tell anybody creative, which is pitch us whatever you want, right? They might as well just kick me in the balls right there. So I started looking at VR stuff like a lot of people would do, and I'm the type of person who doesn't want to go uphill. I want to use the things people hate to my advantage. And so I would hear people say, in VR, I feel like I'm a ghost, and I'm watching things happen. And then I would also watch people put on the goggles, and it looked to me like someone putting on a Mexican wrestling mask. So I said, that's it. I'm gonna do a short about the ghost of a Mexican wrestler coming to visit his family and finding out that his son is a fuck-up. And I'm obsessed with father-son stories, and so that's where the inspiration came from. So why Jaguar? When I was a kid, I have a crazy grandfather and a crazy dad, because they're Mexican. And my dad would say, when you're born, this is what he would tell me as a little kid, when you're born, you're a puma. And every experience you have, good or bad, is a spot, and you become a jaguar. The more experiences you have, good and bad, the more spots you'll have. When you die, I want you to die a panther, because it means you experienced everything. Right? I was 6, so I was like... So, that was the inspiration of why the Jaguar. I'm a big lover of Oscar Wilde, and I love this quote. Give a man a mask, and he will show you the truth. I think Oscar Wilde was talking about Mexican wrestling, and he just didn't know. So, I get to work with all these amazing people. I go up to San Francisco and to Mountain View, and I get my ass kicked trying to ride a bike, and I kind of immerse myself in that world with these guys, and this is a big, huge collaboration. And anything I ever work on, I know this is very masochist of me to say, I really wanted to hurt, not just on the outside, but I wanted to hurt on the inside. I always heard the good stuff, the good artwork, the artist has chopped a little piece of their soul and put it in the thing. I like to believe that there's like an ice cream scoop thing, and it's gonna tear a chunk of my soul, and I wanna put it on everything I do. And so that when I'm making it, I suffer, so that it's that much more rewarding at the end. So Lucha Libre was the big inspiration. As you guys can imagine, Mexican wrestling is a very iconic Mexican thing. I think a lot of Mexican artists, we relate to Mexican wrestlers because of this idea that Lucha Libre literally means the free fight. And these guys are fighting to be free. The other thing that's really unique about Mexican wrestling is I grew up in Mexico City, and so I grew up in a city where you could go on Saturdays and Sundays to watch the fights. And so I would get to see my favorite wrestlers fight, but then I could go to the movies and watch them fight werewolves and vampires and monsters. And then I would be told, those wrestlers live amongst you. They could be your bus driver, they could be the taco stand guy, they could be your teacher, but you don't know because they wear masks. So I literally grew up in a city thinking, I'm surrounded by heroes and villains. This is real. Batman and Spider-Man are bullshit. That's just in movies and comics. These guys are real. So it really affected me, and it really sort of affected the way I saw good and evil, because it was a real personified thing in front of me. Mexican wrestling is full of family and tradition, and masks are passed down from generation to generation. The names are passed down from generation to generation. For example, the image of the people wearing the blue masks, I would love to believe that inside that lady's belly, the fetus is wearing a mask. The other thing in what we do is, I think the best special effect, and it's free, is emotion. If us as filmmakers can make the audience feel something, I think that's a power that should be used for good. And I am obsessed with two emotions. I would love to make people cry, and I would love to make people laugh. So anything I do, I try to hit both. And whenever you make someone laugh, the crying will be deeper. And whenever you make someone cry, the laugh will be harder. And, you know, for example, Pixar is really good at that stuff, hitting both things. Obviously, we did lots of research. I got to go to matches and get drunk. It was amazing. And I remember in one of these matches, an event that happened early on in my life, again with my crazy father. We went to a bullfight in Mexico City, and we're watching this bullfighter, and the bull hits him, and his leg goes flying. My dad hadn't told me that the guy had a prosthetic leg. So everybody in the audience screamed like, "Ah!" The leg falls, and I realized it was a fake plastic leg. And so first of all, I think I peed my pants. I was so shocked. The bullfighter stands up with a sword, right? And he keeps bullfighting with one leg. And I remember my dad grabbing me and going, "Look, Jorge, look what he's doing with one leg. What are you gonna do with two legs?" I think I was 6. So ever since then, I've been really inspired by people who are missing limbs and the amazing, especially athletes, all these amazing things they do. And so that's where the story came from. This is the first drawing. My wife always designs all the girls. I design all the guys. This is a taco stand, talking about who the characters were. Then I sketch usually in Photoshop or Flash. And then we paint things to make them look a little more dimensional. Then we started working with Paul Sullivan, who's the production designer on Book of Life, and now the production designer on Jaguar, and he started fleshing out a lot of the sequences. And so we sort of started going through the story. I don't want to spoil it for you guys. And then we went into the style, and there's a lot of limitations working in VR because these shorts have to be rendered on a phone. And so a lot of things that we're used to on the film side, you can't really do. And so you have to figure out how to work around those things and figure out how to sort of get a look that you want. And even though these aren't video games, I was very inspired by video games in that, you know, I was born in 1975, so I grew up during the Street Fighter II craziness in the 90s. And my favorite thing whenever I would play these video games was when the bad guys lost, I wanted to follow them and see what their life was like after the fights. Like, what were their wives gonna say, or their girlfriends, or what were their kids gonna say? Like, what did they do after the fights? And then a lot of the video games, especially in the 90s, all the Hispanic characters were usually the bad guys. So that's who I related to, and I wanted to follow them home. And so a big inspiration for the look of the short became, well, what if these guys are poor? And our main character is poor, and he can't afford smooth surfaces. And that's why he's made out of polygons. And his wife is from a rich family, but she married for love. And so her skin is really smooth, but her outfit is all polygons because she can't afford good clothing. And so that became the look of the characters. We got to print these out. This costs like a car or something. It's crazy. And then I'm a character designer by trade, so I got to do all the stuff I love doing in character design. Another beautiful Paul painting. This is the villain. I mean, I haven't done mouth charts since I think I was in film school, so I got to do all that stuff. I love tattoos, even though I don't have any. I got to do lots of tattoos. This was the first ring design. And then ideas just kept growing from each other, right? So it's a wrestling ring, but this guy's going there to die. So let's turn it into a sacrificial altar. And again, Google Spotlight Stories were very supportive of some of these crazy ideas. And we just kept going, and then it became a Greek myth about going, Orpheus going to the underworld to fight for his soul. And then we, started putting death everywhere. We did color scripts. We had crowds, and we got to put Easter eggs from Book of Life. So if you guys picked them out, Manolo and Maria are in there. J is me. My wife is in there as E. Manny from El Tigre's in there. And we went crazy designing. We got to do cameos of everybody who worked on the short. Every one of those masks is a crew member. This is Pedo Gigante, which means giant fart. But there's a Lucha Libre name generator on the internet, and that's what the name generator, yeah. So if you ever want, go to the internet. And so it was really fun designing all this craziness. And then this is a beautiful color script by Paul Sullivan. And then we got into the sort of nitty-gritty of what is the story about? And I remember, so the surface story, I'll tell it to you guys, is this wrestler who's over the hill. He's missing a leg. His family doesn't want him to fight anymore. He's going to go on one last fight, and he's going to fight the guy who took his leg. He goes to fight this giant beast of a man, and he gets his ass kicked. His family watches. Just as he's about to die, his son jumps into the ring, and he tells the bad guy, if you want to kill my dad, you'll have to kill me. The bad guy says, fine, I'll kill both of you, and jumps to kill them, and time stops. At that moment, you are in limbo, and the wrestler on the floor, son of Jaguar, stands, opens his eyes and sees you as the viewer for the first time ever and says, Papa, what are you doing here? And so you are the ghost of his father coming down to visit him, and he's talking to you for the first time. And you tell him, my son, I've come to visit you on Day of the Dead. And he tells you, Dad, I failed you, I failed my family, I lost a leg in the ring, I lost everything. And you as a dad tell him, so what you don't have a leg? You still have a heart, and you still have my name. Get up and fight. And so he gets up, he wakes up, saves his kid, the fight continues, and for the first time ever, he asks for help of his son, the young generation. And he tells his kid, son, I think it's time for our first ever tag team match. The little boy gets really excited, gets permission from the mother. The mother says yes. He puts on a special wrestling mask, jumps into the ring, and becomes the leg of the wrestler. And father and son are complete, and of course they win the day, and of course they win the match, and they're given this giant trophy, people throw money, and the wrestler throws the trophy away and says, I don't need a trophy, the real trophy is my family. So that's basically the story of Son of Jaguar. So, this is the director's commentary. My wife saw the story and said, that's about our son. And I said, yeah. And here's the story behind the story. So I have an 8-year-old that has autism. I myself have autism. When our son was diagnosed, I thought that was something that would change our family and my career, right? When I first had a kid, I remember sitting down with my father, my crazy father, and I said, Dad, I'm going to be a father. I think it's time for me to stop taking risks. I think it's time for me to do jobs that are a little easier and more secure, maybe not as exciting, because I can't worry just about me now. I have to worry about my son. And he looked at me, and he laughed for like 10 minutes straight. I haven't seen him laugh that much in a long time. And he said, Jorge, did I raise a coward? Any success you've ever had has been because you took risks. If you stop taking risks for your son, what kind of example are you for him? And then we drank tequila. Luca turned 2.5 years old. He's diagnosed with autism. we sit down again, and I tell him, Dad, things are about to get a little more complicated. I think, I need to concentrate on this, of course. Career-wise, I think I need to start taking even more risks. And he said, that's my son. And that's the idea. Turn the thing that people think is your weakness into your strength. Turn the thing that you think will define you to not be able to do things as the excuse to do things, right? So that's what Son of Jaguar became. It became this love letter to my kid, and this love letter to this disease, and this love letter to this idea that I'm not supposed to be able to do things. But I still have my dad's name, and I still have his mask. So I'm going to do it. And that's it. So that's the short.
Switch with me. And now Cassidy Curtis. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk about how we actually did the thing. So backtracking a little bit, a big part of what we do at Google Spotlight Stories is we try to work with as many different directors as we can, and we learn something from each new person that we work with. That's why we don't have a house style. We don't have, that kind of a tailored house thing. We're trying to develop and discover this medium as it's being invented, and the best way to do that is to work with artists who are going to challenge the expectations of the technology, challenge the expectations of the medium, and challenge us to do things with it that we wouldn't have imagined otherwise. Which is why Jorge is obviously the perfect choice of a person to work with, because it's all amazing stuff. So every show that we start with, every show that we do, it starts with this proof of concept phase, and usually that's a period of about 6 weeks where it's kind of a trial by fire in some ways, in keeping with the Lucha Libre theme, the task of that falls to all of us working together is to figure out what we don't know. What are the unknowns? What are the big questions that we don't have an answer to that this story is going to demand that we answer? So it's all about identifying risks and retiring them. With Son of Jaguar, with Jorge comes in with this, like every director that we've worked with, these are people who have already had tremendous accomplishments in film or in television or in some, one of the existing mediums, and they're coming to this new medium and trying to wrap their heads around it. And it's always a process. It's always a learning process. So I'm going to show a little segment of the very, very first animatic of Son of Jaguar when it was just an idea. And there's a little bit of sound with this one, which we can play. Son of Jaguar. Jorge comes in with this, like every director that we work with. These are people who have already had tremendous accomplishments in film, or in television, or in some, existing mediums. So the thing that I want you to pay attention to here is the camera work. We're cutting from one angle to another. We're doing these amazing camera moves. And so how do you take something like this and adapt it to this medium of virtual reality? All right? So this is where the proof of concept phase comes in. So what we're trying to understand here, these are like some of the questions that we were trying to answer with the proof of concept. So the proof of concept is this 6-week period where we've got technical artists and modelers and animators, the director, Scot, and our sound designer and our producer, all kind of putting our heads together saying, all right, what are the really big questions? How are we going to answer them? So some of the things we were trying to answer with this one, this is the actual proof of concept deliverable that we produced at the end of this 6-week period. So questions like, all right, if you are in the wrestling ring with these characters, what's it like to be standing between a 7-foot-tall wrestler and a 9-foot-tall wrestler? What's the scale of the world? If we're going to have this moment where you're making eye contact with the main character, how does that feel when you're in VR? What's the scale of the world? Is it are these characters little tiny people, in a kind of a shoebox, like stop motion figures, or are they larger than life? And what about the camera? That was one of the biggest things. Can we do cuts? Can we move the camera? Can we take you with us through the world? Can we get away with that? And conventional wisdom among people who are doing stuff in VR up to this point was, no, you absolutely can't. You're going to make people seasick. You're going to make people nauseous. You're going to confuse the audience. And so those are real risks, and those things really do happen. So I don't want to be cavalier about this and make it sound like, oh, no, we've figured that all out, and now you can do anything you want. We did these very specific tests to try to determine what kinds of cuts are acceptable and what kinds of camera moves are acceptable in VR. What can you get away with and what can't you? And so it was through these experiments that we kind of discovered the beginnings of a little bit of a fragment of a cinematographic, language of montage that you could actually use in VR. People like to say you have to throw away all the rules of cinematography when you move to this new medium, and I don't think that that's actually true. I think that the reality of it is that the things that we know from cinema as rules, like the 180-degree rule, right, where you don't make the characters switch places in screen space, you stay on one side of that line of action, right? That rule of cinema is not actually an atomic thing. It's actually made up of a whole bunch of different parts. There's some human perception, there's some psychology, there's geometry, there's physics, and all of these things come together to create this thing, which is very easy to remember, the 180-degree rule. Great. Do you throw that rule out when you go into VR? I would say no. I would say you dismantle it into its parts, and then you reassemble those parts in a way that makes sense for the new medium. So that's what we were trying to do together with Jorge in this process. So what I do mostly in this group is look development, and this is this really vague, nebulous kind of catch-all term, which is very convenient because it means that I can kind of do whatever I feel like doing at any given moment. But it's really about like what's going to serve the needs of this particular story. So sometimes that might be developing shaders. Sometimes it might be writing Maya plugins to make the workflow easier for artists. It might involve modeling and doing effects and all kinds of other things. Here's what that process actually looks like. So this is just every screenshot that I shot during the entire look development process. I love shooting the bugs. I love capturing the bad stuff as well as the good stuff. So you're going to see some really ugly bugs here. And you also see a lot of blind alleys and a lot of like wrong turns as we were discovering and exploring and experimenting with stuff. And it also, a lot of this stuff you're going to look at it and go, that is seriously lo-fi and low-tech looking stuff. It's almost like you're trying to reinvent all of the computer graphics work that was done in like the 80s and the 90s, which is exactly correct, because what we're trying to do here, keep in mind, every director that we work with, we want them to be able to reach the biggest audience that they can. And so we don't want to limit the venue to only the like super expensive, high-end, tethered, VR headsets. We want it to be able to reach the broadest audience we can. And Spotlight Stories began as something that was for mobile phones, and we continue to support that as a medium. So What that means is the pressure that it puts on you when doing the development of the look is every algorithm that you come up with, every shader that you come up with has got to run not just at 90 frames a second on a Vive with a really beefy graphics card, it's also got to run at 60 frames a second in stereo on a 3-year-old mobile phone that's been dropped into a Google Cardboard, headset. And that story should still play just as well, and hopefully it should look just as beautiful in that medium as it does in VR. So these are just a few of the things that we were developing. Most of the stuff that you see up here didn't end up in the show, but it all ends up being useful to us in other ways. So let me drill down and get into a little bit more detail here. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is that because this all has to run in real time, and because you're doing it all using a lot of the work that I'm doing is GLSL shader work. And you can't debug that stuff. So if you're coming from a computer graphics programming background, you're probably used to being able to open up your code and use a debugger and see what's going on and fix your problems that way. All of our debugging we have to do visually. Did that pixel turn pink? Okay, then something went wrong. But the best way to debug is to just use, this is something that I wish I could have done. If you really want your debugging to be super badass, use Danny Trejo as your test image. So here's the final look. I'm just going to show you a little bit. This is just some of the imagery from the trailer, but what I want you to pay attention to is the lighting. All of the lighting in the environment is actually baked-in lighting. It's just baked into texture maps. So there's no real-time lighting being done at all on the environment. It's only on the characters that the lighting is actually being calculated in real time. And this is something that we did with the team at Real Effects because they didn't want to sacrifice any of the richness of all of the bouncing and radiosity and all of the wonderful soft shadows and things that you get when you can render that stuff offline, all of which would have been way too expensive to run on a mobile phone. And so we really have to kind of pick and choose and spend our very precious GPU cycles where they're going to count. And that's with the characters and their shadows. So I'm going to do something here that's a little risky. We like to say, oh, what's that?
I think you might have a tab open that's playing some sound on it.
Let's find out. Hold on one second. This is a good time to do that. A tab open that's playing sound. Let's find out. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Is it good? Okay. So it wouldn't be a live event without the risk of bloodshed and possibly death. So I'm going to do some live demos using our engine. So let's just see if this works. So this is actually our the Google Spotlight Stories player playing on my laptop here, and. So this is just one of the things, one of the little problems that we had to solve was just trying to figure out, can we make eye contact with the character? It seems like a simple thing, and it is a simple thing. It's a simple shader, but we did tests like this to see if we could make it work. Funny thing about this shader, so you can see he can switch between making eye contact and not, but when he's making eye contact with you, he really is making eye contact with you, the camera. This is something that actors study, right? Being able to make and maintain eye contact, right? But they always have to pick an eye, right? If you're going to look at another actor, one of the things they train you to do is pick one eye and keep on that eye so that you're not bouncing back and forth between them. But this shader can actually do something even better than that, which is that this shader can actually look at both of your eyes at the same time, because it's looking at your left eye when when you look at it through your left lens, and it's looking at your right eye through the right lens, which is actually horribly wrong, but we decided not to fix it. Some other fun stuff that we got to do a lot of Jorge's work involves really fun 2D graphics, 2D effects. So things like these flames, for example, or the lens flare that comes up from the lights up here. These are all two-dimensional visual effects. And we wanted to make sure that we had a way to make that stuff play well. So these are effectively, something akin to sprites. But one of the really big challenges was this moment. So during the fight, there's this one spot where this happens, right? And I went to animation dailies over at Real Effects, and the animator who was doing this shot showed this, and all of the animators were doing their work in Maya, and using Real Effects awesome rigs. They were super flexible and cool, and doing these crazy smear frames and these amazing poses that look really great from this one camera angle. And they were shooting a play blast out of Maya from this one camera angle. And the animator in this shot actually created this starburst effect to put behind the character to emphasize, this kind of expressionistic effect. And I was looking at that in dailies and thinking, well, how the heck is that going to work because this is just a cone that was sitting there behind the scene, and it only worked from this one point of view. So how is that going to work if you're in a VR headset and you could be 6 feet tall, or you could be 3 feet tall, you could be sitting down or standing up or anywhere in space? And so again, what we have is actually this very simple shader hack doing something pretty similar to what we were doing with the eyeballs, that wherever you are in that space, it's always going to be exactly behind the main character's head. And so you could be a little kid, you could be a giant, and it's always going to work. So the other really fun one was just working with light and shadow. And in particular, because this is all taking place in this smoky arena, I'm kind of just picturing everybody is smoking cigars, in the audience, right? And the atmosphere of that ring was so important. And so we knew that we were going to need not just volumetric shadows, but volumetric shadows that are dynamic and react with the characters. And so a lot of that look development stuff that you saw up there was us figuring that stuff out. So these are being calculated in real time, but again, it's an expressionistic effect. It's not meant to be photorealistic. How does it actually work? Well, you've got basically everything has to go through, everything has to be rendered, and everything has to be a color image at some point. So if you're used to using compositing systems like Nuke, you're used to being able to have all kinds of interesting floating point buffers and things like that. That's all lovely. Remember, we've got to make this work on every device, including 3-year-old mobile phones, and you don't know what kinds of buffers are available on them, so everything has to fit into a color buffer. So what this is right here is this is a depth map of the scene that's been crowbarred into the red, green, and blue channels of a color image. And so that's just one way to kind of squeeze information out. And then what you can do from there is you can also take that same volume and stretch it out away from the light source, render the front of that, render the back of it. And what you get from that is you get 3 numbers for every pixel on the screen, which tell you just enough information to let you calculate how much of the volume of space is actually inside that shadow. Is it a real shadow? No, it's totally not. It's got all kinds of horrible artifacts that you would notice if we didn't blur the hell out of it and then composite it with everything else. So it's just enough to convince you that you're there in that space with the characters. So let's go back to the slides here. And have we lost our place in the slides? It looks like we have. Let me just go back to where we were. All right. So that's kind of a little bit of a window into the production and actually getting this stuff running on device. What is post-production on a Spotlight Stories project? I have never worked in games. I'm coming from a film background. And in film, post-production is you're doing sound, you're doing color timing, you're doing final paint fix and all the little cleanup details. But the rendering of the film is done. Once those shots are in the can, they're in the can. They don't come back out of the can. But everything that we're doing is being rendered real time. Everything is live, and so nothing is ever in the can. You can always break the show, and we did a lot. Working with real effects, these guys are also film people, right? And so they're used to having a render farm, and when you're working for film, whether it's like live action special effects or a fully animated feature, it doesn't really matter how much data is involved in rendering a frame, because the frame is always going to be the same number of pixels. The frame is the frame. But in real-time stuff, it matters tremendously how much data everything takes. So 90 gigs was how much data was involved in making Son of Jaguar. That's actually like what is sitting on our hard drives when we're doing this thing. Whittle that down to like only the files that are actually still being used in the show. Get that down to 15 gigs. Take that stuff and compress it. And run it through the kind of our tools have various automated processes for taking animation that was a live rig in Maya and baking that out to some format like FBX or Alembic. And when you do all of that, that whittles it down to about 6 gigabytes of data, which is like more than you could fit on your phone. Certainly not something you ever want to stream. And so with a lot of very heavy optimization work, you get that down to 4 gigs, which is what the size of this thing is that you'll see if you go and watch the show after this up on the Vive in the VR room, or if you watch it on Steam, that's the 4 gig version. But we also needed this to work on mobile, and we had to squeeze that down to 1 gig for the release on the Pixel 2 phone, and down to half a gig, 525 megs. To be able to play in stereo on Daydream at 40 frames a second, I think was the frame rate that we got to. This seems like very dry and technical, but this is like this weird part of the process that you only have to do in this context that you never would even have to think about in film. What I would say is if you're considering doing any kind of a project like this in real time, think about this before you start. Don't wait until it's post-production time to do this, because the stuff that you have to do to your beautiful animation can get pretty brutal if you weren't planning it from the beginning. And there's actually some irony when we were talking about, Jorge was talking about the characters being too poor to be able to afford smooth surfaces, and that's why they look like they're made of polygons. Well, it turns out that making the characters look like they're made of polygons was actually more expensive than making them look smooth. So it kind of bit us in the end. Just some of the things that you have to do to actually get this stuff to work, instead of having the normals. What is a piece of CG animation made of? It's made of a bunch of vertices moving around in space that are connected into polygons, and they have normals that let the lighting do its stuff. Every piece of that data costs you something, and the more of it you can kind of slice away or find a way to calculate in real time, if you can do that efficiently, the better. So we calculated normals in runtime. We baked out the alembics, the animation files, at less than the full 24 frames per second frame rate for a lot of the characters. The bottom row here is the original animation. The thing right above it is actually 12 frames a second, but you can't tell too bad. It's not that different when you're looking at it at arm's length on a mobile phone. All the way at the top, I think that's baked out at like 8, frames a second. So And then there's even more drastic things that you can do, like actually retopologizing the entire mesh. This is something you really want to avoid if you can get away with it. And we did it, and didn't like the way it looked, and we undid it. But there were a lot of things that we were able to get away with it on, and it actually looks fine. So, but yeah, on the main characters, that was taking it too far. So you cut away at the fat until you start cutting into muscle and bone, and that's when you stop. But there's never a moment without some bloodshed. It's just part of the process. Scott's going to come up and talk about sound, and the thing that I always think about, that Scott's work really brings to these projects. I always think about this moment in Raiders of the Lost Ark, when he's in the tomb full of snakes, and he escapes by pushing out this concrete, this stone block. And I must have seen that movie about 20 times when I was a kid. And one night I saw the movie and the sound was turned off. And I watched that scene, and I noticed for the very first time that when that stone block that felt like it weighed a ton, falls out of the hole, it bounces twice. And I had never noticed it before because it sounded so heavy when I was watching it with the sound turned on. I've thought about that ever since, and I realized that at least half of the time when you see a film or a game or one of our projects and you're convinced that it looked amazing, there's at least a 50% chance that actually it just sounded amazing, and that convinced you that it looked amazing. And that's the magic of what Scott does. So he's going to talk to us about the sound.
Nicely done. Is it me or is this thing bouncing? All right, totally safe. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. As Cassidy said, my name is Scot Stafford. I'm a composer and sound supervisor and creative director of music and sound at Spotlight Stories. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the music process, a little bit about sound in Son of Jaguar, and just a little bit of a background. Back in 2010, I started Pollen Music Group with some wonderful fellows, J.J. Wiesler and Alexis Hart, and this is us, just a typical day at the office. And back in 2012, I came in along with Doug Sweetland to meet the team, which was pretty small at the time. This is where I'm going to embarrass a couple people in the audience. No, you guys are off the hook. No, I'm going to totally embarrass them, right? Yeah. So James Ritz and Rashid El Garab are here in the audience. Just stand up for a second. We're going to put some lights on you guys. Can we get the cameras on them for a bit? Yeah. These guys were really instrumental in getting this whole thing off of the ground in a big way. So I came into work on Windy Day, the first Spotlight story. I had worked with Doug Sweetland on Presto, and Jan Pinkava needs no introduction, the creator of Ratatouille. And the looks on our faces pretty much sums up what was going on in our heads at the time, sort of wrestling with the new challenges of the medium as we were trying to get this project off the ground. And in the meantime, we worked on all these other Spotlight stories. I'm going to advance through this. Altogether, I think we've worked on, now it's 13, but we're here to talk about Son of Jaguar. Just a little bit about Jorge. He has a lot of really interesting ideas that were really fun to just kind of go along with. You work with someone like Jorge, and you're sort of along. You're along for the ride. And one of the first ideas is he showed me this really beautiful song that's a Mayan song about a great jaguar in the sky. called Bolam Chon. And he played this, actually no, he just mentioned it, and then it was just completely out of coincidence. I think I sent it to the wrong email address or something, but I discovered this recording, which was actually the first time he had heard the song, right? And in it we thought we had a very beautiful, simple melody that could be a theme to Son of Jaguar, something ancestral, both for the original Jaguar and our hero, his son. And I imagined it being passed from father to son and there being some kind of change there between them, some kind of transition from more traditional to modern. And the simplicity of the melody told me it could go in almost any direction. Let's see if we do some music playing. This is the theme, just played on a guitar. Turn it up just a little bit, thanks. So that was the basic theme of the whole short. The story begins as we, as the ghost of the father of the son of Jaguar, that being Jaguar. Anyway, we float into the boiler room scene along with the candles of the ofrenda, ancient Mexican folk instruments, harps, rattles called oyoyotes and ayacatlis, intone the theme and provide like an otherworldly shimmer. It's the sound of Jaguar crossing over from the spirit world into the real world. And this is us in a recording session capturing the sound of a lot of these rattles. I depleted the eBay stock of all of these Mayan instruments to create kind of a 360s planar 360s field of sound around that would kind of summon the spirits here. Once we transition into the scene, we first meet Son of Jaguar and his family, but no transition has yet happened, musical transition. He's stuck in the past. He's so stuck in his shame for having failed his father that he forgot about his family right in front of him. So for the opening scene, I didn't want the theme to be about him at all. It's really about his wife, Rosa, and her son, Adrian. I could feel Jorge's emotions in this scene, and I wanted them to come through for what a lot of us would at first be a very, very visually comical scene, a giant luchador in costume. But in order to take us completely away from comedy and into this tearful scene of the family, I arranged the theme for Mexican classical guitar, accompanied by string quartet, and let the music be about this really sweet yet high-stakes family drama between three people that love each other and fear for Son of Jaguar's life. It's this goodbye that they're saying they think he's going to die. And so the music wants to take this really seriously and not tip the hat and be funny in any way. Then comes, after Jaguar's descent into the ring, we meet this ultimate baddie, where the music takes a little detour into the world of Lord Calavera. Jorge wanted something inspired by high-octane death metal or punk, so I went Metallica meets Dragon Force meets Jaguar. And Jorge also wanted a real Mexican musical stereotype in there, and I love that idea that Calavera is this offensive abomination. I was a little concerned about doing cucaracha and the Mexican hat dance in the Trump era, but screw it. We went there, and you can hear it a little bit if you listen closely. A little departure from the family drama, and I don't know if you guys could hear it, but it's dun 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 dun. Anyway, so we went there, and that was really fun. So after Calavera's intro, the fight begins, and the music stays in this high-octane metal vein. Calavera dominating the fight. And at the bleakest moment, time freezes, and Son of Jaguar is visited by us, the Father. Here we get the music of the Ghost World again as we're frozen in time, and the Father speaks to his Son. Because we are the Father's ghost, we wanted it to sound like we are speaking. You, the audience, should feel like you're speaking. And this is where it got pretty tricky. So I'm just going to talk about sound for a moment. It's a really big element in VR. We can do things that most people have never experienced in other mediums. We can put sounds all around you, surround sound in ordinary headphones. We can spatialize, we can externalize sounds so they sound here and there, but we can also internalize sounds and put it in your head. So my first experiment was to put these teeny microphones into Jorge's ears, deep into his ear canal, essentially turning his head into a custom binaural microphone. It was really interesting, but the results were really mixed. This kind of recording really only works for one person, in this case, Jorge. Only he can really hear the difference between what his voice sounds like when it's coming from inside his head. All we hear was a sort of a, tinny recording of his voice. So we didn't really hear that. And that's one of the fundamental problems with binaural sound. I don't know if you guys have been following developments in VR audio, but one of the problems with it is that we all have different heads and we all think we're hearing the same thing, but we're not. And so it's been one of the challenges that we've been working on. So instead of going that sort of literal route, we worked with our favorite sound designer, Jamie Scot, to get kind of a more filmic sound that nonetheless pushed all of our audio tech. And briefly, there are a few methods of achieving surround sound in VR using ordinary headphones. Let me just explain. Thank God I can scroll. Back in 2014, that's like 21 years ago in VR or dog years, we were working on our first live-action spotlight story, Help, directed by Justin Lin. Because it was 360 but linear with no time elasticity or interactivity, I thought it was a great opportunity to try a new format that was just beginning to appear at the time, that actually had been invented a long time ago but had new applications in VR, called ambisonics. With ambisonics, we can design or author a complete sphere of sound, which is then mixed in real time to binaural stereo and rotates freely, tracking the user's head and gaze. It was also a way to take potentially hundreds of sound sources, discrete sound sources that individually need to be baked, and bake them into only one. For filmmakers in VR, it's all about trying to wrest back control, creative control over the experience, all the controls we've relinquished and given to the user. And so ambisonics brought the final mix back into VR from film and simplified implementation. Again, instead of implementing hundreds of sounds to all these emitters over the scene, we're just putting one sound in there, one file where there could have been hundreds. So we had to build some tools to make all this possible, and there's that pride that you feel when you've pushed the tech forward and have done something and accomplished something. You want to justify it and you want to use it a lot and constantly remind yourself of how good it was that you spent all that time developing it. So, returning to Son of Jaguar, however, it was the first show we built from the ground up in 6 Degrees of Freedom. I don't think we've talked about that quite yet. 6 DOF VR, you guys probably know all about that, but the idea is a lot of VR, especially live action VR, is 3 Degrees of Freedom or 3 DOF, where you can freely look around, but you can't actually translate in space. You can't walk forward, you can't get closer to anything, you can't put yourself in between things. It's a 2D projection on a 3D sphere. The problem with ambisonics is that it's fundamentally 3 DOF. It's a 2-dimensional projection onto a 3D sphere, which is all you need in most VR, but there's no 3D info. You look at 2 objects over here, but in 6 DOF you can actually get in between them. And so all of a sudden you realize you need to have them as discrete sources again. So we scrapped the whole ambisonics thing, mostly. We ended up keeping it in an important way. So once I saw the size of the 2 wrestlers, Has this been playing? I don't think so. And how close you get to them, I realized we needed to pull most of the sound design back into these discrete sound objects called emitters. They're virtual speakers placed into the world or attached to character rigs, and lots of them. So we can get close enough to Son of Jaguar to hear a huge difference between his head, his left hand, his right hand, his left foot, and so on. And so this meant not only breaking up that nice little file back into hundreds, but also improving how they're mixed in real time, using real-time effects like Doppler, distance attenuation, real-time reverb, and so on. And so I think it's hard to see, but you can see it's all text, but you can actually see these emitters in space that are tracking every movement of his limbs. So the result is by far our most complex and immersive Spotlight story to date. We still use ambisonics just for stuff that's a bit further away, that you can't in room scale VR, get closer to. And we use it as a mixing platform. So altogether you hear a ton of headlock stereo, ambisonic sound fields, and many dozens of sound objects placed all around you. So cheers to Spotlight Stories, Pollen, and Jamie Scott for making it all sound so great. But wait, what about Son of Jaguar's musical theme? I really hadn't figured that one out. I knew it needed to be big and reflect a big step in our hero's journey. I knew it had to say, our hero finds himself with one foot in the past and one in the future, but both in his culture. So, of course, we needed mariachi metal. It's got to kick ass and feel like a great sort of 90s Street Fighter game. It's got to meet Calavera's energy, and it's got to be Mexican. So we brought Los Tapatillos into the studio and created yet another arrangement of the Bolam Chon theme. So much fun to record those guys. So I was really happy with the results, and then I added, of course, the metal band. And you have the sound of that band in 4/4 time chugging along with these chunky power chords, and at the same time you have a mariachi song in 3/4, a waltz. And that's the sound of victory, both bands feeling their own time signature, and we recorded it that way, but then mixed together. The big jumble sounds just great. So that is Son of Jaguar. Yeah, that pretty much wraps it up. So thank you guys. So I just want to check in on time. He's doing it. 45? Oh, wow. Okay, cool. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Son of Jaguar's little sister project, Sonaria, which we were able to kind of sneak in right before Son of Jaguar was coming. Son of Jaguar was actually an inspiration for it because we knew that we were going to build this new world up in Six Stuff VR, and I knew that we had to build a bunch of new tech into our tools and our pipeline. And so actually, before I talk about it, I'm just going to show the trailer. Sonaria began as what we call an experiment, and that might sound a little bit confusing because every one of our projects is very experimental in nature. But in this case, what we mean by that is it's an idea from the internal team that seeks to answer a question: what aren't we doing, what isn't being done, and what can be done better? And so, as I said before, it's been an incredible privilege to work on all these different projects with directors like Jorge that come in with ideas. But it was an amazing opportunity to sit back and say, okay, we've worked on all of these together, and ask ourselves these types of questions. And for me, I was really focused on how can we do sound better in 6 Degrees of Freedom. So I came up with this idea of a journey through multiple natural environments defined by their sound and acoustics. Basically, this idea that if sound is doing its job, it's a storytelling job. It's not a tech job. It's not just a sound job. It's actually telling you where are you and what are you looking at. And so it's funny to start with sound. Usually sound is a post-production process. But we actually started with, at least conceptually, the idea of sound here. So we're kind of talking about it first before we talk about visuals. But that's kind of in line with how we approached Sonaria. So I had the idea of having 2 creatures that chase each other and transform into each other. And so I immediately started working on some of their vocalizations, the Foley. I didn't have an idea of what they looked like yet, but I knew that they wanted, I wanted them to make a sound that was simultaneously a heartbeat, which is like the expression of their life force, and a sonar ping, which is how they find each other. And I knew that I wanted the environments to be immersively realistic and extremely rich. And so we went into the studio and started recording. I knew I wanted there to be a lot of underwater sound. And so we went into the studio and I bought a lot of really strange tubes. And I threw my microphone. This is legit, just FYI. One of the things that you can do to make an underwater microphone is you wrap a phone in a condom and put that underwater and record it. And I just remember bringing this is one of these incredible stores in Chinatown in San Francisco where they sell everything. And so I was bringing all of these strange tubes up to the counter, and then I got up there and said, "Oh, condoms!" And I think I almost want to go back and just explain to that person that this is what we were working on. Anyway, and one of the things that ended up being an important aspect of this is I thought it would be amazing for, it was something I realized on Pearl, that you could actually stand up outside of the car. And there's a whole different world up there. It goes from internal to external, it goes from cozy to being really exposed. And I thought that was really fascinating, the idea that in VR you could do something that you just couldn't do in a film, which is put people in real time on a threshold between 2 different worlds, so that at any time they could just stand up or sit back down and transition. And so we spent a lot of time, you'll see, we're underwater, we hear lots of reverb down there, we hear a lot of the acoustics, and then we can go up and down, and there's quite a lot that needed to be built in order to have something this simple take place. We have 2 different sound spheres called ambisonic zones, and we have an entire sphere of sound design for above, another for below, reverb below, we have occlusion in between the 2, and then we trigger sounds based on the velocity of us colliding with the surface of the water to actually trigger sounds that are actually like the surfacing and submerging sounds that are triggered and played at various volumes depending on how quickly you do it. And that was actually really tricky because anyone who's ever worked on real-time effects and on games is what you would expect to hear is if you're hovering right around the surface, you would hear the same sound triggered like 1,000,000 times per second. And you don't hear that in Sonaria now, which is really nice. Briefly, the music, I knew I wanted to focus on strings and vintage synthesizers and explore what I pretentiously called radial symmetry, which is basically when you're going from left and right stereo symmetry, if you project that into a 3D world, that's no longer symmetrical because you turn your head and suddenly both left and right are in your right ear. And so you have to think radially in terms of a 360 sphere. And so we brought the musicians into our studio and arranged them in a circle around a spherical mic array. And I had 3 cellos. That's what ends up happening is that the heavy instruments kind of weight themselves. And so if you have the cellos on one side, the mix kind of goes like this. So I had them arrayed. And the result is really nice. As you're listening to the music, you can turn around in the mix while you're watching the show. And you achieve kind of a musical symmetry no matter where you're looking, which is pretty satisfying. We also developed something called focused surround, where you can. So what you're seeing is you have this stereo mix, and then as you rotate, the mix is actually focusing around you in real time. The virtual speakers that you're looking at are turning up and turning down based on gaze. Another thing I had fun playing with is animals that sound like musical instruments and musical instruments that sound like animals. So here's the sound of the, not seagulls, yes, seagulls, played by a cello. And I won't go into, ask me about anamorphic sound if you're curious later. So these are some of all of the sort of tech that we built for Sonaria that were eventually brought into Jaguar. Visually speaking, the story is great, and it's, as was mentioned before, Sonaria was just nominated for its visual effects, which is awesome because it was all about the sound, but we knew ultimately we had to wrestle with the visuals and that they were going to be really tricky. So I was speaking with Rashid El-Garab early on about this idea of like actually visuals are going to be really, really important. And he showed me this amazing video by Chromosphere, a short film called Forms in Nature. And I just took a look at this and knew that it was a perfect match. There was something very, it was very sort of science reverent, very stylistically cool. Looked like they would do something really interesting at where 2D and 3D meet. And very quickly, I put together a pretty stupid visual here that you see below. I thought it would be cool if this, it's okay for me to say that because I'm not a visual artist. This teardrop shape that would basically represent a creature, and that the music and sound, the sound would do the heavy lifting in terms of telling you what was happening. And so I sent this to Kevin Dart over at Chromosphere, and with this idea that you could play with 2D, you could play with minimalism, and in so doing, you could have a world that translated really well into VR, because sometimes by reducing visual detail, we can focus our brains more on sound, and we can also get away with things like moving people in space. In Sonaria, you go from the depths of the ocean to tens of thousands of feet in the air with the birds and crashing back down again, and you actually don't get dizzy, hopefully, relatively speaking. And so I showed all of these ideas to Kevin, and he said, well, what if the teardrop was a building block of this world? It was like a natural building block. And what if everything was made out of that shape? And what came next was this visual exploration where he and his team were trying to figure out what can we make out of this teardrop shape. And it was amazing. Basically, the answer was anything. You could make anything out of this teardrop shape, but we were pushing them to be more and more minimal. And that's really fun to do as a creative person, because minimalism is thrown around a lot. It's what people think what they want, and then they start adding the detail back in, but we actually wanted less and less. So that's a really fun challenge for them. So we ended up with these 2 teardrop creatures, and eventually we ended up with this is basically, the way the concept art looked, and it's also exactly how the finished product looks as well. So we go from these unicellular creatures to fish, to frogs, to squirrels in the forest. And this was a really interesting challenge. Transparency is really tricky in anything, but especially in real time, especially when you want sort of a deterministic artistic control. You don't necessarily want the colors that result from the overlapping of two other colors to be literal. You want to actually be able to decide exactly what every combination of every color is in that scene, and that was something that Cassidy was really interested in and helped out really early on. Here's a scene where we turn into lemurs, and it's one of these scenes where, again, if this had a huge amount of detail in VR, you'd be up in the trees looking down and you would want to throw up right away. But again, by using gradients and a really minimal visual design, we ended up getting away with a lot of this. Here are the bats, all the way up to the highest reaches of the sky, crashing back down, deep dive back into the sea, and then to the majesty of whales, and then back to the beginning. One of the interesting things in VR, coming from traditional film, is how do you storyboard? And Chromosphere came up with it's kind of hard to see, but if you look at the top of this, I mean, in every cell you see a quadrant of where you're looking in the 360 space. And so they were able to, it's a very simple idea, but it was kind of elegant, come up with an idea of how you can storyboard in a way that actually also gave you a preview of how things would kind of move in 360. And another nice thing about doing it that way is that you just project that onto a cylinder, and all of a sudden you have a layout pass in VR that you can actually put onto a device and actually look at. Here's an early layout pass. Oh, that video didn't work. So we approached the environment scene changes. Again, if you're translating people in VR, moving them against their will, it's a vomit fest. But if you approach scene changes theatrically, like the way that a theater lighting and staging would work, it works quite well. And so here, between this image and that, you see that actually the only thing that's changed really is the gradient. So you can feel like you're way up in the sky to feeling like you're just over the surface of the water, just using a gradient. And here's a quick clip showing one of our set transitions. You can see through sleight of hand, we went from the bottom of the forest floor to the top, and morning to night in less than 5 seconds. And here's a great image. This was the first pass we got at what the marsh would feel like with the frogs. So this was the concept art, and this is the final. And that's really fun for me to see. And so that is, in a nutshell, Sonaria. So thank you. Yeah. So I'm going to pass it back to our fearless leader, David Iseman. David?
Trying to find my notes. How are we doing on time? So it's 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
Okay, 15 minutes before Q&A. Okay, great. So this is intended, we're going to kick off the Q&A by doing we're going to Q&A ourselves. So we're going to pretend for a moment here. Hold on, I got to find my notes. Talk amongst yourselves.
Hot mic.
Hey, go. That was awesome, man. There's a lot of stuff I've never seen.
Yeah.
Jorge,
Yes.
so nice to meet you. Our viewers would love to know, a question that's racing on their mind, as a filmmaker, first-time filmmaker in VR, attempting a piece, what tools from your theatrical experience helped you, and what would you bring back from VR into the 2D world?
I think that the thing that really helped, it's a beautiful question.
It was written better than I said it. But
I think for any of you guys who are going to do VR and who are going to try to jump into this, to me it's like a mosh pit. You jump in there and then people are just punching you and you're trying to dance to the music as they keep kicking you over and over.
what was the example you gave
Yes.
to the 12-year-old today?
So I gave a talk at a school, an inner city school, these are tough kids. So they were ready for the tough answers. And he said, Mr. Gutiérrez, what is it like to be a film director? Is it hard? And I said, kid, imagine if someone kicks you in the balls 20 times every day. That's directing. And the kid was like,
I'm only 6.
So the thing that I think for any of you guys who want to do VR, the thing that really, really helped was I stopped looking to the future and I started looking at the past, right? Story is story is story. It was the first way people communicated. It's going to outlive all of us. We live in a world driven by narratives now, right? We want a narrative. We want to put a narrative into everything, right? The weather, the food we eat, everything has to have a narrative. So for me, the big aha moment was stop looking at movies, stop looking at other VR pieces, stop looking at video games, stop looking at all these new mediums, and look to the past. And when you go to the theater, everybody sits in a different seat. Everybody sees a different version of the play. If you cough or if you go to the bathroom, the play keeps going. It doesn't stop for you. So VR to me is digital theater. You're getting the best seat in the house and you're getting to watch a virtual play. And so I started looking at plays and I started studying how are directors in the theater getting people to look at things. They're telling the actors to walk in certain ways and stage their settings in a certain way. They're having the lighting directors light a certain way. The music and the sound, everything is helping guide your eye and follow the action. And then there's no close-ups in theater, and there's no cutaways, and there's no montage sequences. Well, technically, sometimes they do it. But the way you use that language, I think, translates better to VR than cinema. And what I took away from VR that I'm now bringing into film is I really took for granted cutting and framing. And like your parents, you don't appreciate your parents till you leave home, right? And you don't appreciate your mom's cooking, and you don't appreciate any of that stuff until you don't see them. And so for me, I've never been more thankful to have cutting and framing. And so now I see it with completely different eyes. I will say that cinema is, over 100 years old. I feel like VR is just starting. These are really early pieces. And I feel like the weight of the medium right now is still wide open. There's no Citizen Kanes out there or these,
Pac-Man era.
Yeah, we're in the great train robbery era of VR. Like, you make an animated movie today. Guess what? You're up against Spirited Away and The Incredibles and like all these like Titan films that are incredible. With VR, I think it's fair game. It's still wide open, and it's still. I'm guessing these amazing pieces are going to come from obviously people who are willing to take a risk. For me right now, the best VR piece I've ever seen, I just saw a week ago. It was, and everybody should go see it, especially if you love VR. Go see González Iñárritu's Carne y Arena at LACMA. It won an Oscar already, and this thing is incredible. It's an experience. So I think the medium is new enough and exciting enough, but at the same time, I don't think it's reinventing storytelling. It's just a different way to tell stories. Does that answer?
It does, and it's a good segue to something that went on in production. So the second question, which sort of feeds off of where we were with the first question. Actually, we all could answer it, but so on the production, there was a moment, so you were talking about treating the production as a live stage play, right? And I know we went through some experiments and iteration with layout of trying to figure out how to get the viewer, looking or oriented in a specific direction, and what that meant and what we went through. And so my question is, how did thinking about the production as a live stage play inform the making of the show? And what discoveries did you make along the way?
Well, another big thing that happened is...
Versus boarding it.
Yes. So we boarded this thing, we did an animatic, and then we threw it away because it didn't really help as much as we thought it would. But it did help us sort of time the story, and to some extent it helped us stage things. But the biggest problem for me was, after you do this VR stuff for a while, you don't feel stuff anymore. And so going down a corridor, I didn't feel anything. Doing 30 cuts, I loved it, right? Like, I was an old prostitute by that point. I didn't feel anything. Turns out, the audience is new.
Delayed reaction on
yes.
that one.
Did you guys catch that?
I'm from a third world country, so excuse my metaphors. And so we had to be really careful with this idea that the audience, this might be their first VR experience. There might be kids, there might be older people, there might be people who are not as, who are more sensitive to moving the camera. And so that was a giant, for me, it was really hard to come to terms with the fact that this isn't for me, it's for the audience. And just because I don't feel anything, that doesn't mean everybody in the audience doesn't feel it. And so we would test it, and we'd have multiple people try it. And if enough people complained that it made them want to throw up or kill themselves, then we didn't do it. So that was a big lesson about why we're doing this. It just can't be for the filmmakers, it's for everybody.
So in shooting, I'm just going to freeform. So when we were doing this, there was a moment where we had to go in all together and kind of, rip the car hood open and just start throwing engine parts out, which was mostly layout at the time. And I think the analogy that we were discussing was, okay, imagine, so this is Broadway, and the stage is built, the actors are all hired, they all know their lines, they've all rehearsed it, everybody knows everything, costumes, everything's set, except it's night before opening, and we still don't know stage direction.
Yes.
And so what did that do? So that was what we were thinking about when it was, okay, how do we tell this not from an animatic 2D perspective, but how do we tell this from, think of it like a live action production?
Well, we looked at plays where the audience is walking and they're being taken from place to place. And we also thought about, well, if we're going to move one way and there's a set and we have to rebuild the set in order to go through it, this is the type of production where it's actually cheaper to rebuild the set than to move the camera a little bit, which blows my mind, by the way, because in film we'd never do that. So coming to terms with that idea was very hard. Also, again, coming from TV and film, you build your movies are done usually script, storyboard, animatic, layout, animation, lighting, right? Obviously, I skipped a bunch of stuff in the middle, but those are sort of the big ones. Here, it's more like a lasagna happening all at once. You have to have your whole story figured out, all your dialogue figured out, to some extent, all your staging figured out as you're building it. So that, I think, is more close to video games. And it seemed like video games people didn't face them at all, but through the film people and to the TV people like me, I was like, what the fuck? This is crazy. So that was a lot of trying to learn a new way of telling a story, and then coming to terms with this idea that you're seeing the crappiest version every time, and having faith in people like Cassidy that things will eventually look amazing. And I remember always looking at Cassidy in the eyes like, Cassidy, it's gonna get better, right? And he was like, yeah, of course. And I was trying to find, is he sweating? Is he hiding the nervousness? But he spoke the truth. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. I was going to say that the underlying sort of comment was that we kept defaulting to was if I was your mother, and this was a live stage play, how would you? And I couldn't walk well. How would you walk me through this arena in a way that I could experience and see this without being overwhelmed? I think that was
That was a big one. And you guys always threw family members at me.
Yes,
it was
we
like, what if we need to do something that your son and your
father
mother
against you.
and your father will cry when they see.
You're a coward.
And then you're a coward if you don't do this. So thank you for all the guilt. It was delicious.
We have 3 or 4 minutes left for our part, and I wanted to ask, this is for Cassidy and Scott. Spotlight Stories has made a number of shows in VR, and what kinds of challenges did Son of Jaguar pose that was different than the other productions thus far? Outside of sound, we heard about a little bit in terms of 6DoF sound.
Yeah, just really quickly, we could be so close to these huge characters, and that's one of the holy grails of sound in VR, is being able to get the sound of presence and proximity. Ironically, you can make things sound great if they're sort of this far away or further, but actually getting that sound of things close up, and how important thematically the idea of intimacy was. You really wanted to feel like you were right there with these incredible characters. So yeah, it was how big they were, how close you could get, how intimate it was, the scale. That kind of touches everything. It was just a really fucking challenging project.
Well, this was the first one, you might want to talk about this. This is the first one where we approached making it for 6DoF first versus the other way.
Yeah. Well, that was a big one. The fact that we were doing it in for these big tethered headsets first, and then adapting it to mobile from that.
I'm not sure we'll ever do that again.
We will not ever do that again.
Really?
Yeah, because so the first one of these that I did was Pearl, and we started thinking that it was only going to be on mobile phones
3DoF,
because
right.
the 3DoF experience, and that it was only going to run on this much smaller, much less powerful hardware. I mean, it's still incredibly powerful, but it's not as as powerful as this like giant hulking desktop machine. And so going from that to the big desktop machine was like, I can breathe. I've got all this extra room to play around in. Let's add a little extra detail to the set. And with this, we kind of did the reverse. We started in this big roomy environment, and then you saw the size of those squares that get smaller and smaller. That's exactly what it feels like to go from that big roomy environment to the smaller and smaller devices. And Rashid, I'm gonna embarrass you again. When I first started working with this team, I went up to Rashid, who was like the technical lead, one of the founders of the project, and I was like, Rashid knows everything about everything. So I'm going to ask him, what's the poly count? Like, what is the limit? How many polygons can I put on the screen? And he was like, well, it kind of depends on what you're doing. I mean, you could do millions or thousands. It depends on, like how complicated are your shaders and all this other stuff. It's this dynamic, flexible thing. I could never get a hard answer. He said, put as much as you think you need, and we'll find a way to optimize it later, and we'll scale it back if we have to. And that's the approach you should take. Make it look great first, and then we'll figure out a way to make it efficient. And that's exactly the approach that we took with this, except we were doing it in this huge, roomy environment of VR. So made it look super awesome. And then when it was time to optimize, it was like, oh, we've got to really cut deep.
I mean, we're in this we're in this ever sort of quandary where part of our sort of mission statement is that we're trying to break and develop emerging tech,
exactly.
right? So part of Son of Jaguar and Pearl is to break the system, like fuck the whole thing up. But at the same time, we have a production release date. So then, our engineers are like, what the hell are you doing? Why, what do you mean? We can't just keep jamming this thing into like the phone without throwing stuff away. So we haven't answered that question, but it's a fun one to keep asking.
But I mean, if there's a takeaway from the experience we had on this one and all the other shows combined, you know, it's just think about all of the mediums that you're going to release your show in from the beginning. You know, don't wait to start testing on the different devices that you're gonna eventually release it on, because you don't want that stuff to come up and surprise you too late for the creative decisions to be, you know, organically made.
So thank you for listening to our all-male panel set of guests tonight. I know I went there, and we'll hand it over to Lynette.
Do you have any stage questions? Remember, I have a little tub here of enamel pins to give you if you ask a question. Thank you, guys. Let's have a round of applause, actually. That was amazing.
Hello, my name is Emmanuel, and this question is for Jorge. Do you have any other tradition or any other part of the culture, Mexican culture, that you are going to work on? Like probably, like, I don't know, like a posada in Christmas, or I don't know, La Revolución or something about in a future project, or a quinceañera?
Well, you know, to me, Mexican culture is like a buffet, and I have my favorite dishes in there. Of course, I've gotten to do Lucha Libre and Day of the Dead, and, you know, to some extent, a little bit of the Mexican Revolution. And so there's two dishes that I've been savoring that I'm gonna hopefully get to do sooner than later. One is pre-Hispanic stuff. I really want to do a Mayan inspired film. I love Apocalypto, so I can't imagine what that movie would be like directed by a Mexican person. And the other thing I want to do is, when I was very little, I went to see Star Wars. And when the movie finished, I was really sad. And my father said, again, my fucking crazy Mexican father, "What is wrong with you? Like, we just saw magic. Why aren't you happy?" And I was like, "Papa, we didn't make it." And he was like, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "There's no Mexicans in space." And he didn't even flinch. He said, "Jorge, Chewbacca's Mexican." So that's where I want to go. I have a film that I'm developing right now, which is a kung fu space western, and it's about Mexicans in the future.
That's amazing. All right, next question, Sue.
Hi, my name is Sarai, and this is a question for Jorge again, sorry. I actually went to a talk that you gave when Book of Life was coming out, and you always said that whenever you approach a project for TV or film, you had to choose two in between of story, character design, and animation. Did you feel that VR gave you more freedom, or like do you feel like you had to like compromise the three elements more?
Okay, so when I was in film school, I figured out that as a student in cinema, or in animation, there are three pillars. There's story, design, and animation. And if you're really good, you are good at two of those three. Most people are usually only good at one. The hardest one of those three is story, right? So when I was in school, I put all my energy into story and design, and I didn't put a lot of energy into animation because I didn't want to be an animator. So now that I'm working in the professional field, I think it's the same. I think when you look at giant pictures from giant studios, I still see it. I still see story and design are the strengths of some studios. Animation and story are the strengths of other studios. I don't want to name the studios, but I think you know. I don't see anyone hitting all three. Book of Life included, by the way. It's really hard to hit all three. Like, I'm a film that has incredible story, incredible animation, and incredible design. I dare you to name one. It's usually two of those three. So he wrote Ratatouille. I think Ratatouille has incredible story and incredible animation. I don't think design. He worked on it, so he's a little blind. But I bet you've never asked anyone, what's the most beautiful designed Pixar movie, and they mentioned Ratatouille.
That's exactly what they said.
Really? Is that your favorite Pixar animated design movie?
No.
Incredibles.
I'm sorry,
Incredibles
David.
might come out.
Your Honor, I rest my case. Anyways, but that's what we should all aspire to.
I feel like we're going to have a wrestling match on the stage right now. Any more questions? Okay, we'll go.
Hi, my name is Sabia. I had a quick question about sort of interactivity with VR and kind of how that affects the design and story and the animation aspects. And just wanted to hear more of your thoughts about how VR and interacting with the people within the story, how that kind of affects your process in terms of, you know, constructing the world to kind of fit this person that is a part of the world and yet so removed from it in a way, how that affects the sound aspects, how it affects the animation when you're moving them around or constructing the set, and if you think that interactivity is more of a key to making VR work and making the medium more successful, more popular.
I can start. So one thing to consider on the interactive question, because there's a lot of different styles of interactivity, and one of them obviously is what you're used to with games, choose your own adventure, and sort of a selection process. We've taken sort of a mantra that it's more of an experiential interactivity, so that the environment and or story or whatever responds to what you're paying attention to. And if we're doing our jobs right, you never really can tell what's being manipulated around you. If you watch one of our older, 2 years ago, which is like 2 years ago, right?
Long time ago.
Christmas one from Aardman Entertainment, that one has something like 38 or 40 subplots in it. So depending on where you look, it triggers a sequence of events. So, you know, I don't know, I'm making this up. You know, the lady in the front row says hi, and then I'm watching that narrative. So then that whole chain of narratives like comes to a completion by me watching that, and maybe it's you over here throwing a glass of water on her or something like that. But there's a bunch of those things. So some of it's like that, and some of it, when we were explaining with Pearl, is experiential and audio. So if you think of what Scott's described with Sonaria, the amount of interaction that actually has to engage you and adapt to you as a viewer is pretty significant, based on you standing up and breaking thresholds and all of that. That's pretty sort of groundbreaking stuff out there in the CG world. So to us, that really is sort of an interactive question. And then the other moment I would say is that we do try to find places. It's not really places where you're going to choose something, but it's places where we want to give the audience a moment to breathe and look around. And in that case, the narrative sort of has to naturalistically wait for you or adapt to you.
I mean, and you know, the theory behind that, you know, is it's not for no reason that we kind of as a group tend to make that choice, because it comes from like what story really is. You know, story is a process that's happening up here in the audience's mind, right? And people tend to characterize like experiences either active or passive, right? Like, you know, if you're sitting in a movie theater watching a movie, you're being passive, and if you're playing a video game, you're being active because you're making choices. But I fundamentally disagree with that. This is just me, but to a certain extent, I think this colors the choices that the whole team has made, that the experience of just watching a movie is an extraordinarily active experience for your brain, because the story does not work. It doesn't resonate with you emotionally if you aren't actively constructing the narrative in your head. You know, you're being shown this sequence of images, And from that, you're discovering the relationships between these characters and how they feel about each other and where they are spatially relative to each other. You're building all of that in your head. And if you take somebody whose brain is engaged in that task and then give them a menu and say, what do you want to do, A or B? Right now, you're taking away from them that other thing that they were doing. You're now forcing them to make this other choice. And I think people who play a lot of games experience this when you're playing, and then comes a cut scene. And it's like, I'm not playing anymore, now I'm just watching this story happen. Okay, now I get to start playing again. And the reverse happens, I think, if you give someone and force someone to make a conscious choice in the middle of the experience of story. So we try to make all of the choices that people make unconscious. And the flip side of it is that it's about respecting the diversity of your audience. And I don't mean like what we normally mean by diversity. In this case, it's that every single individual in your audience at any given moment is interested in different things. They're curious about different things. You might be much more interested in the lighting in this room than in what we're telling you up on stage. And we should respect that choice, right? We should respect what you're curious about and reward your curiosity with something interesting that also helps the story move forward in your mind. We shouldn't punish you by boring you or making you lose track of the story because you chose the wrong thing. So that kind of, as a fundamental principle, it applies to 3DOF and 6DOF VR. It applies to, even mediums that don't exist yet, just as kind of general principle that your audience is not one monolithic one person that is always going to make this one set of choices. They're going to make a spectrum of choices, and that spectrum is always going to be diverging and spreading apart, and it's up to you to kind of guide them and persuade them into a path, or respect the choices that they've made and give them something that's worth their time, for it.
We watched one gentleman at Tribeca watch Pearl, and the entire time he was looking at the front stairwell.
Climbing under the table.
Under the table, and we're thinking, we have no idea if this person's getting anything that's going on.
Yeah.
And he comes out of it, and he recites the entire story and he's emotionally moved, and wow, that was amazing. And we're sitting
like, telling us what had happened in the story, and we're like, how did you see that?
You didn't see any of it.
Yeah,
right.
He's like, I heard it.
Yeah, he experienced
I knew it was happening. Yeah. So that's how it works when it's, if we did our jobs right. That's what happens.
Okay, and the next question? Yeah.
Hi, my name is Andrea, and this question is for Jorge. One of the things that really drew me to the Book of Life and just your style in general is how tactile everything looked, almost like stop motion puppets. Would you ever consider doing a feature film in stop motion or even a VR piece if that technology ever is accomplishable, I guess?
My dream of dreams would have been to have done Book of Life in stop motion. I think you can tell by watching it. And it was priced at $180 million if we had done it in stop motion. So there's no way I could have gotten that made. I'm now working on a Lego movie. I'm directing a Lego movie, and it's, I think, the closest I'm going to get to stop motion. But there's a quality to stop motion that, as good as CG, I mean, obviously CG is incredible, and you can make things look like stop motion. There's still something about stop motion that I think connects, this is just my theory, although Henry Selick, and maybe he was super drunk, seemed to agree with it, but I think stop motion connects with a part of you when you were a kid and you played with figures. And it fulfills that fantasy that figures are moving by themselves. And I think that is something that only stop motion does. I don't think 2D animation does it. I don't think CG animation does it. Stop motion has that magic. For me, the tactile quality that you talk about is folk art. I love folk art, right? And the reason I love folk art is because it's imperfect. And what are computers really good at? Making things perfect. So let's go the other way. Let's make him imperfect. And I think what makes folk art so unique is that you're seeing imperfections, which immediately makes them human, right? The flaws in all of us, that's what makes us who we are. That's what makes us unique. So folk art is flawed art. And so let's use computers to fuck up and flaw all these things to reveal the hands of the artisans. So that's why I love folk art. And I would kill to do a stop motion movie. I just don't see it in the cards for me. Stop motion tier.
Hashtag tier.
Yeah, hashtag it'll never happen.
Do we have any more questions? I see 2 hands. We can probably just about squeeze these 2 in.
Hi. Yeah, I watched Son of Jaguar 3 times on HTC Vive, and I loved it every single time.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Did you watch it here?
No, at home.
Oh.
Heartwarming.
You must
Thank
have a
you.
cool system.
My question is about the use of space. I really love the use of space in both Son of Jaguar and in Sonaria. I love the way that you can look up and see like warped ceiling tiles in the boiler room. I love the way that, the villain is up in space when he does, you have to look up to see the moves that he's doing and the way he's introduced. In Sonaria, I love the way you can look down and see those whales. So how do you plan this out? Because Scott, you mentioned the use of 360 boards, but how does that? Do you use something else for planning out when you look way up or when you look way down? Do you just resort to like 3D animatic and Maya, or what do you do?
That's a great question. I would say that we learned a lot on all of our shows, but especially the first 4. And I think in general, something that we learned from Help, for example, is that Justin put the 2 main characters, the woman and the creature, I don't know if you guys have ever seen it, but it's all this long chase scene. And for a lot of the film, they're separated by 180 degrees, which is a really cool idea, but in practice, it requires this. And sound really helped because you could hear that the creature was over there even if you didn't see it, but still, that presented kind of a choreography problem for the viewers, is that it was too much work for people to really follow the story. And so it's something that we want people to think of. I know that Jorge, you were thinking about that a lot in terms of getting people to first of all, the opening scene is so beautifully choreographed. That's just all very, I feel like you're using the space. If, like you said, if you look around at all the boilers, they have these sad facial expressions. But it's nicely choreographed in terms of just the way the family moves through the scene. It's something we thought a lot about in Sonaria in terms of tracing lines and really empathizing with the audience and giving them reasons to look around, but not making them have to work so hard. And so, yeah, I think that's something that, although it makes me think of the wraparound quotient or whatever we called it. The winding number. So this is something that's probably not going to exist in a few years, but right now with tethered headsets, you have to think about how many times they actually perform a circle. If they go more than one winding round, they start to tangle themselves up into chords. So the idea is, as some of these guys have already said, is you want to get your stuff, whether it's a 360 storyboard that turns into a layout pass, which I think is a pretty helpful tool that you guys could use if you ever work on this stuff. But get your stuff on device and really put yourself into the perspective of someone who has no idea where to look and where the story is, and that's always going to be a very painful process. As you see somebody, it's like what you want them to look at is like right here, and you've made it so easy, and there's all this lighting, and it's like you've put arrows saying like, look at this one thing, and people will just kind of sit there looking right there, and it's very humbling. But I think ultimately the answer is just get your stuff into device and start experiencing it on device as early as possible. You'll discover all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, you said 3D animatic, and I think that's actually like a very strong thing to do. You know, we're encouraging every project that we work on, you know, going forward to get something quick and dirty and cheap into the actual device as quickly as you can, so that you can learn from, you know, like make those mistakes early and quickly and without a lot of expense. Because the worst thing is to, you know, commit a lot of resources to an idea that you only discover isn't going to work after you've spent a lot of time on it. You know, and so right now there aren't really a whole lot of tools for like just sketching something out in 3D, although they are starting to come into existence. You know, there's something called AnimVR that I think is still in beta, and there's another one that I just heard about today called Tivoli, I think. There are tools that are, you know, and of course there's Tilt Brush and Blocks and all of these other tools that are great for like really quickly sketching out an idea in VR. Quill, you know, and Medium. So all of these, you know, creative tools in VR, I think, are things that people should be using more to test out their ideas, and particularly if you want to, you know, if something is experiential and animated, you want to really try to get that into the actual device that you're using as quickly as you can. In as rough of a form as you can, so that you don't feel bad about throwing it away completely and redoing it. Because you will, you'll have to, because it's experimental. We, you know, really like Jorge was saying, this medium is so young. These mediums, because it's not really just one medium, are all so young. There isn't a rule book yet. You know, everybody is still just sort of groping their way through, you know, blindly into this new space, and you know, so just go in expecting to make tons of mistakes, and you won't be disappointed.
Yeah, and I think, you know, story, I was super lucky, and I've got to work with super experienced, amazing people. And one of the big lessons I learned was environment as a character. What can the environment tell you, and how does it help the story? So for example, backwards engineer everything, right? If you know, for example, Son of Jaguar, if we know it's going to end in a giant arena with thousands of people watching this match, then you should go to the opposite to start your short. You should go to a tiny, constrained space with no people, so that at the end, you build to that moment. If you have a character who's giant, you put him next to little people, he looks even more giant. You put him in a tiny environment, he looks really uncomfortable, and you immediately feel bad for him and immediately feel empathy for him. Then when he goes to face the villain, you make the villain gigantic. And so this whole time you thought this guy was huge. Well, turns out he's tiny compared to the bad guy. And so you start building all those things. You know, the environment in Son of Jaguar, there's lots of emotional manipulation going on there. You go into this little boiler room, and it's decrepit and dirty and old, and then you see little kid drawings on the walls, and you see a kid's bed, and you see a baby's crib, and you immediately feel terrible for this family that's trying to make it work in this room. Then you meet a wrestler who's depressed, and if things weren't bad enough, he's missing a leg. So already we're starting from a moment where, unless you're a horrible, heartless bastard, you immediately feel bad for these guys, and you're immediately rooting for them. And I think empathy is the hardest thing to get to really fast. You want your audience to emotionally be invested in your hero and your leads and in their struggle. And for us in Son of Jaguar, for me, it was delicious, because for the first time ever, I got to make people put on, you know, the VR goggles and become someone who could walk around these environments and walk around these characters and walk in someone else's shoes. And I keep saying my favorite thing about VR is that it's an empathy machine. It allows you to feel for others instantly because you're with them, right? When you're watching a movie, you're watching from, it's like a zoo. You're watching from far away, but you're never in the movie. In VR, you are watching this guy beg his wife to help him put his wooden leg on so he can go kill himself. Like, you're with them, you're in these dramatic moments, and you get to experience them in a way that, you know, for someone like me who loves these characters and loves these worlds, I got to experience that in a whole different way. So everything is planned in animation, right? We get to make up whatever we want to do. So whatever environment you guys have, what is the environment telling you? How are you getting people to feel for your characters without even meeting them? Just by being in their house and by being in their room, you should know who these people are, and you should know who the people you're supposed to root for are. If you open that short in a beautiful, pristine gym, that tells you nothing, right? So, environment as character.
That was an amazing answer. Thank you so much. So we're going to squeeze this one last question and we'll try and answer it quickly.
So this is a question for both directors, and it's based on you guys having different backgrounds. So in the early days of animation, right, and even sometimes in TV now, there's not really an editor. It's more like a sound editor that gets credited as such. And so, because you come from sound and you come from film, editors are the ones telling you, no, make it shorter, cut it short. So when you're doing it in VR, are you guys the editors yourselves? Is there actually a room for a voice to be that, like make it shorter, pan shorter? What's the mechanism driving that restriction?
I'm going to go back to Pearl for instance. So what we've noticed, all of us come from different backgrounds. Jorge's TV and movies, we're predominantly movies. Rashid back there is predominantly games and tech. Scott is all over the place, movies, sound, audio, tech. People default to what they know mostly. So by engaging in filmmakers, you're sort of almost guaranteed that they're going to default to traditional filmmaking tools to solve problems when they're stuck, right? One of those tools or processes is editing. So on Pearl in particular, we had Patrick who had boarded out 26 shots with cuts in different sort of an arena of experiences that were happening. And in general, we felt like the notes that we kept getting was that some of it was too confusing and we needed to make sense of it. And we actually found in that regard, finding an editor, in this case a documentary film editor, to work with Patrick, did exactly that, because the editor's role is to turn around and tell the director in a non-confrontational way, because he's expected to say, that's shit, you need to cut it, I don't understand, like just do this instead, right? And you need that voice in that room to do that, and we haven't disregarded that ever since. So currently, on our current production, we're going through that. And Jorge had editors, two editors, right? Yeah, that worked with you throughout, sort of, and Scott.
So I think it's a huge mistake to leap from, well, there's in some, interactive VR films that we're making, to think that, oh, well, since there's time elasticity, there's no reason to have an editor. Editors are sort of masters of time, as you sort of hint at. They have a really good sense of the timing in between point A and point B. And just because there's some time elasticity in between them, that doesn't mean that you don't have to commit to some degree of that. One of the things we discovered, after doing several of these, is that we actually don't want there to be an unlimited amount of time that we wait for you to look over here. There's a point where these sort of looping states just sort of continue no matter what. And so I always find that if, as a composer, if I look through every single possible path through the show, if it's time elastic, that doesn't mean I'm off the hook and don't have to think about how long it takes to get from point A to point B. I look and say, oh, well, actually, this is either going to be somewhere between 13 and 17 seconds. So I can still craft a meaningful build or some kind of meaningful bridge between these two scenes. And so I think involving an editor in VR is actually just as important as it would be in traditional film, because it's that sort of voodoo of like how long should we really allow people to be in this looping state, and how can we actually, oh, you know what, these are linear. How can we make these scenes work perfectly? I think there's just as much of a need for good editors in VR as in any other form of film.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys. Let's have a huge round of applause.